Traveling to museums is a popular pastime. These celebrated institutions educate visitors on an array of diverse subjects, from art and music to history and science. Until now, most science museums, like the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, have relied on the traditional scientific method model in constructing its exhibits on topics like dinosaurs and evolution. In 2007, however, the Christian apologetic ministry Answers in Genesis sparked controversy by building a museum that displays a creationist approach to science and, consequently, a different perspective on prehistoric animals and the origins of life. What are these museums' approaches to science? How are they different? How are they similar? And how do they affect our understanding of the world around us, as well as our own existence? Built in 1920, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History's mission is to engage, educate, and enrich people of all ages. The Cleveland Museum of Natural History takes patrons on a tour through the Amazon, Africa, North America, and the Arctic, showing the diversity of animals. The museum also has a large dinosaur hall with several fossils unique to the museum, as well as geological exhibits with an earthquake simulation, and numerous artifacts from space. Landmarks of the museum include the remains of Balto, the beloved sled dog, a replica skeleton of Jane, a juvenile tyrannosaurid, the most complete Coelophysis bari, and the early hominid, Australopithecus, named Lucy after the famous Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, founded by former curator Donald Johanson.
My name is Roy Kalin, Manager of Astronomy Education at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. I come to this position to assist with enhancing our sky shows, adding more material and content to the sky shows, getting the observatory more in use for the public, and also adding educational offerings to our palette of school courses. I see it as the opportunity to bring together several nice things that the museum already does to help the visiting public. My contribution is to help to coordinate and further enhance what the museum intends to offer for the visiting public.
Well, ever since I was a kid, became interested in the natural world, so I had questions about how it works. How do natural areas work? How do they function? How do they benefit us? So I've always had this long-lasting and long-standing set of questions that I wanted to answer and to explore, and science provided that outlet.
According to a recent ABC poll, 60% of Americans subscribe to a creationist viewpoint, believing God created the world in 6 days. On Memorial Day of 2007, the Creation Museum opened its doors to the public. Located in Petersburg, Kentucky, not far from Cincinnati International Airport, the museum was designed to be within 1 hour's flight of almost 70% of the United States population. The museum offers 60,000 square feet of exhibits and cost $27 million to create. Answers in Genesis, known for their newspaper, website, and radio programs, built the Creation Museum in order to equip Christians with answers to defend their faith, and wanted non-Christians to respond to the gospel message.
Well, I'm one of the three founders of Answers in Genesis, which is the builder of the Creation Museum. But we knew 13 years ago that we wanted to build a facility like this that would be a walk through history according to the Bible, from Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation, to show that all of the Bible could be trusted. We wanted to do two things. We wanted to equip Christians to have answers to help them defend their faith, because science, so-called today, modern science, supposedly has shown that the Bible is not trustworthy. We wanted to show Christians that the Bible presents the true history of the universe, and also that Christianity can be logically defended, that it's very reasonable. And secondly, we wanted to have the non-Christians or skeptics to come here and see that same message and also respond to the gospel message. And so we are evangelistic. We're not hiding that at all. We appeal across the board, whether Christian, non-Christian. We do want young people to come here, and that's why we have the animatronic dinosaurs and 50 plus videos, because young people nowadays are not inclined to walk through a museum and stand and read a lot of text on the walls. They want to watch videos and go into our planetarium and our special effects theater. And when it comes to different people groups, we don't like to use the word races. We think that's a very evolutionary laden term. We have a whole exhibit designed to show visitors that all of us, regardless of our skin color or our eye shape, go back to an original couple, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were probably a middle brown. And if they were that color, then you can explain all the different skin shades today, from light to very dark. The attendance at the museum takes in a broad section of not only Americans, but I'm surprised to see so many people coming from overseas. And in terms of being a national outreach, the very first day we opened in late May, when we had 4,000 people here for grand opening, we had someone go out to the parking lot and counted 35 different states represented by looking at the license plates. And so even though we expect that this is going to be a major regional attraction, and it is already with about 145,000 visitors, the first 11 weeks that we're open, we're seeing people come from all over the country, and I've even seen 2 Alaskan license plates here at the museum. This is a very high-tech museum, and what we've done is we've married the best of what you would see, let's say at Universal Studios or Disney World, with what you would see in a natural history museum. Nowadays, museums have to have that entertainment factor, the wow factor. Not only the animatronic dinosaurs, but in the special effects theater, the seats shake and mists of water are blown on people. Families like to go to those types of facilities that are not just educational, but also will hold the interest of the young people so that they'll learn something.
One of the first exhibits in the Creation Museum is a dinosaur dig. One paleontologist is using scientific evidence such as carbon dating to draw conclusions of how old the fossil is. The other scientist uses the Bible to discover the age of the fossil. The museum then compares explanations by human reasoning and the Word of God for the burial of a Utah raptor. Under the scientific or human reasoning, river sediments buried the raptor gradually, but the Word of God says the Great Flood buried the raptor. Similarly, the Creation Museum compares human reasoning and God's Word to the age of the Earth. Scientists believe the Earth is billions of years old by the Big Bang Theory, while the Creation Museum explains the Earth only to be a few thousand years old.
Everybody has preconceptions. Everybody has presuppositions, things that they hold to be unquestionable, and they go in and they look at the evidence through those presuppositions. And what we try to do is get people to think through their presuppositions, because I found that really only Christian presuppositions are the ones that make sense. Because without those Christian presuppositions, how could you do science anyway? How could you have this uniformity that we see in nature? How could you have laws of logic by which we think about things rationally? Now, my secular colleagues, certainly they can do science, but I would argue that they're being inconsistent because they're borrowing things that only make sense if Christianity is true, and yet they're denying the Christianity from which these things are derived. Yes, scientists go into the evidence thinking that the world is millions of years old, and they come out with the conclusion that the world's millions of years old, and that's not surprising. But if they can break free from those presuppositions and consider Christian presuppositions and think in terms of creation and a worldwide flood, they could come to much different conclusions.
The starting points. I mean, who are you going to trust? I mean, man, whose mind changes like all the time as to what they believe in human reasoning, that's the basis for how you're gonna live your life, how you decide. And I mean, too, I really question them to look at, why do you believe the way you do, and what do you really believe, and why do you believe that? For example, morality. How do you judge what's good and bad? Well, most people would say, well, yes, Jeffrey Dahmer killing and eating people is clearly wrong. Well, if you have an evolutionary worldview, you have no basis for that. Absolutely no basis, because truth is relative. Truth is just the chemical interactions in your brain. It's what you decide is right. And Jeffrey Dahmer decided that wasn't right for him. So, I mean, it's an extreme example, but it really illustrates that who are you, who as an evolutionist, who is that person to judge somebody else, because that's truth to them, and that should be okay. But from a biblical worldview, I can say that is wrong, because God said, do not murder.
You can't even do science, really, without a biblical worldview, and a lot of people don't realize that, because science relies on uniformity in nature. When I do an experiment tomorrow, I expect to get the same result as I did today, if I set it up the same way. And as a Christian, I'd expect that, because God upholds the universe in a uniform fashion. But if you don't believe that, on what basis can you expect that things will be the same tomorrow as they are today. And a lot of people would say, well, it always has been that way. But that's actually circular reasoning, because if you say, well, it always has been that way, therefore I expect it always will, you're assuming that the future reflects the past in order to prove the future reflects the past. But as a Christian, those of us who hold to the Bible as our worldview, we have a basis for science and technology, and so it makes sense for us to start from the Bible in our account of origins and the way we approach science.
If the ideas of creationism, if the ideas of astronomy and cosmology are all subject to the same method, that is the scientific method, then one can easily determine whether or not one has a valid advancement of knowledge. It's what scientists and science relies on. If it can't be validated, it's tough to add it to the knowledge that we're acquiring. This is not in any way demean what people may have as their own personal belief. Science doesn't look at belief. It looks at the amount of data it can gather, the observations one can make, and the validation of that data.
It starts with a wonderful idea, all the great ideas that Christianity came up with, but it starts with a predisposed history. And then what the quote-unquote creationist scientists attempt to do is to find evidence to back up what they have learned from the Bible, the New Testament, the Old Testament, and so forth. Scientists do things differently. We actually go out into the world, whether it's physics, astronomy, biology, what have you, and we ask specific questions about how the Earth works and all the organisms that live on it, without a predisposed notion of what the answer is. In other words, we're testing hypotheses. Unfortunately, this concept of creationist science, which is an interesting social concept but an invalid scientific concept, it is trying to go to a predefined goal. And it would be the same thing, and this is a ridiculous concept, but let's say you had a team of researchers who wanted to prove Bigfoot. Well, they're already sitting there saying that Bigfoot exists. Now they're going to go and try and find evidence. That is bad scientific technique.
As patrons travel through the museum, they eventually arrive at a crossroad in what life would be like if the world abandoned the Bible. Here, images of homosexuality, abortion, and stem cell research flood the walls. After seeing this future hell, the patrons then travel back in time to the biblical beginning of the earth. Emerging from the darkness, patrons find themselves in a bright room at the dawn of creation. Here, the museum shows the creations of God through lighted posters and several LCD screen televisions. Patrons then enter the biblical Garden of Eden. Here they find Adam with several prehistoric animals. The garden also includes a waterfall for Adam and Eve to bathe, but Satan in the form of a python is lurking in the background. Upon exiting the garden, patrons learn of how Eve stole from the tree of knowledge and shared the fruit with Adam. God throws Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden because of this. After sin enters the world, the museum shows several graphic images, including starvation, nuclear warfare, and the pains during labor. An Amish patron viewed the images and quoted, "This is how life is like outside our community." As a result, from sin, Adam and Eve must kill animals for clothing and as sacrifices to God.
Up until that time, it was a perfect world. You didn't have cancer, death, bloodshed. But in Genesis chapter 3, everything changes. Now, we look around even at the beautiful grounds here of the Creation Museum. We see beauty, but and so we see some of the remnants of God's beautiful, perfect creation. But in this world today, we have death, struggle, survival of the fittest, if you will. In fact, probably the most asked question we've received here at Answers in Genesis since 9/11 is, why would a loving God allow so much suffering and death in this world? It's probably, outside of the general creation evolution question, maybe the most asked query from people. And so we tackle that head on here, and we explain why we had the Holocaust back in the 30s and the 40s in Nazi Germany, why tsunamis happen, why we have earthquakes. We tackle that head on and explain that Genesis has the answer.
The Creation Museum continues the biblical walkthrough with a realistic ark. The final exhibit is a presentation of the film The Last Adam that depicts the death of Christ.
So this king He's hanging there. I hear him say, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." I'm a soldier of Rome. I'm not afraid of anything. I tell you what, that day, I've never seen anything like it. This man was, truly, he was the Son of God.
I can tell you that I know of at least 12 workers here at the museum who built some of the exhibits who were not Christians, but they were contractors. They were putting up drywall and doing the plumbing. We know of 12 of them who decided to receive Christ as their Savior as a result of working here at the museum, and even just as importantly, talking to some of the staff to get some of their questions answered. So yeah, I'm grateful to say that already this museum has been evangelistic.
The main attraction at any natural history museum is typically the dinosaur hall. Children love dinosaurs for their large size or from their portrayal in movies, but also from the sheer mystique of dinosaurs. But what do we know about these extinct animals?
Dinosaurs, of course, as we know them, as we tend to think about them, these large, very interesting, dynamic animals, went extinct some time ago, but yet they're successors now carry on today. So even though a lineage of animal goes extinct, we do see that we have relatives essentially. So the big part of science today in terms of looking at common everyday relatives of dinosaurs is examination of birds and how they resemble dinosaurs both morphologically, anatomically, and even behaviorally. Right now, depending on who you talk to, there are about 600 or 700 species of dinosaur described in the scientific literature. Many of them very small, some of them, of course, very large. So they're a very diverse group. That being said, this may only represent 10% of the dinosaurs that actually existed. So we suspect somewhere under 10,000, maybe around 7,000 or so different dinosaurs ever existed during the history of Earth before the major mass extinctions occurred.
Many people, including the scientists at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, start with scientific evidence from research in fields of paleontology or geology in order to draw conclusions about dinosaurs. Some creationists choose to search for answers about dinosaurs from another starting point, the Bible.
I mean, there's many dinosaur names, so to speak, that are out there, but many of them represent just a tooth, possibly that they found, or a bone fragment, and so they don't represent necessarily, we just don't know how many are out there. We don't know how many of those are actually the same dinosaur, but we've given different names to them. Some estimates are that there were probably about 50 different dinosaur kinds, and so that we can pretty much classify all the dinosaurs, at least that we know of today, into those 50 different kinds. And so again, it would just be like, for example, if you have a horned dinosaur, well, maybe some of them had one and some of them had three, some of them had two, but they're all horned dinosaurs that had a horn coming out the front.
And the thought is that some major catastrophe happened where the Earth changed, and it changed so rapidly that these large, monstrous animals could not change quickly enough in terms of their offspring and so forth. So in other words, they did not adapt or evolve to fit that changing environment. So 65 million years ago, we see a huge drop-off in the number of dinosaur species that are on Earth.
Well, as far as proving whether or not the dinosaurs were around, we do know that. As for proving their demise, scientists have pinpointed a large crater buried beneath sand and sediment just off the coast of Mexico, around the Yucatan Peninsula. This crater, about 100 miles wide beneath the surface, the immediate surface of the Earth, seems to be in age about 65 million years, which would coincide very nicely with the demise of the dinosaurs. In other words, we don't find dinosaur fossils any younger than 65 million years ago. So it's believed that an asteroid body, perhaps upwards of 10, maybe even a dozen miles wide, the estimates vary, collided with that area now known as the Yucatan Peninsula, threw up a huge amount of debris, earth, clouded out the sun, blocked it out perhaps for several growing seasons, and when that happened, you had plant life that no longer could survive. It may have set off tidal waves, it may have set off a conflagration over a couple of continents. Point is that all the soot, ash, and material blocked out the sun. So those dinosaurs that might have ate leafy vegetables and trees and plant fronds, they went starving. The meat eaters who might feed on the vegetarians, they too went starving. So in a matter of a few years, it's likely the dinosaurs were wiped out. The actual evidence comes from core samples and from samples taken from rocks around the world. When a meteorite hits, it leaves a signature in the soil. It leaves that which later becomes incorporated in the hardening rock. This is an amount of material, a spike, if you will, of an element known as iridium. Iridium is not normally common here on Earth. It's found in small amounts, but it is more plentiful in asteroids or in meteorites. If a meteorite were to hit, spread all of its material in that cloud of dust and gas and debris, that would settle into the sediment and eventually be incorporated into the sediment. Later, geologists poking through rocks would find this material, and they could identify this iridium. In fact, there are in several remote and diverse locations around the world pockets where the iridium element does show up. And it shows up at approximately the same place in the timeline virtually around the world.
We're talking here, the time frame is about 6,000 years for the age of the universe and all, about 6,000. So go back 2,000, you're at the time of Christ. Go back 2,000 before that, you're at the time of, basically about the time of the flood, right around there. 2,000 before that, you're at the beginning of creation. So somewhere around probably, 2,000 years after creation, sometime within there. I don't know an exact date or year, but 2,500 years or so, they became extinct. And we don't know, if you're going to ask me why, I don't really know. I figure that's the next question. We don't really know. The world was a very different place after the flood. We do know that. And the world had drastically changed. And so it's possible that just from, even in the book of Job, which we think was written probably shortly after the flood, there's more mentions of the word snow and ice in the book of Job than anywhere else in the Bible. And so it's kind of interesting that maybe, climatic changes, that we talk a lot about the ice age. If you've already been through the museum, we talk about the ice age. And the conditions would have been such that an ice age would have probably occurred shortly after the flood. And so maybe that was part of the reason the dinosaurs just could not deal with that type of environment. And so they possibly died off as a result of that. Plus, people would have hunted them. I mean, think about how scary a T-Rex would be. I mean, overall, I wouldn't want to be hanging around with it. So it's possible, too, that they were hunted to extinction even. And some people have this image that dinosaurs are, like, really huge. I mean, you watch Jurassic Park, and you just get this horrible image of dinosaurs, so to speak, and them being very, 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 very large. But there's nothing to say that Noah had to take on the ark, or that the animals that were directed to the ark were large, big dinosaurs. They could have been juveniles, for example, young ones, more of, possibly closer to reproductive age or active reproductive age. Also, most dinosaurs on average are about the size of a sheep.
Large animals outside of dinosaurs did not really have a chance to coexist with them, simply because dinosaurs were numerous, not only in terms of the number of species, but in terms of the numbers of individuals that were present. They were competitively dominant, disallowing any evolution of large, say, mammals to actually exist with them. They would have just not had a chance. The concept of humans coexisting amongst dinosaurs is untrue. There is no evidence to suggest that happened. And indeed, since most of these major dinosaurs that we tend to think about when the word dinosaur is mentioned went extinct 65 million years ago, that was long before the first human ancestors ever walked the earth.
Land animals, which would include the dinosaurs, were created on day 6, along with mankind, along with Adam and Eve. There's no reason to think that they wouldn't have lived side by side. And of course, before the fall, before man was disobedient to God, they, would have peacefully coexisted. I mean, there's no reason for them. They weren't going to be dinner for each other, so to speak. So, because we know from, again, the first chapter of Genesis that man and animals were only permitted to eat vegetation. They were not permitted to eat meat. And so, there's no reason to think they wouldn't have gotten along, so to speak. After the fall, obviously things changed, and now we have sin in the world, and the world is cursed. And so we have mutations, for example, happening. We have things not in the right relationship, out of sorts with one another.
Well, dinosaurs are just like our modern large animals that we see today in areas like, say, if we go out to the plains of the Serengeti or the plains of North America or where have you. There are some that were very predaceous. So we have some of these smaller guys like Coelophysis. It's approximately a human-sized dinosaur, but it used to run around and actively hunt in packs, for instance. There are others that are very large, like T-Rex, which did have some leanings towards being a predator as well, but also is suggested to have been a scavenger. So if a large, say, dinosaur is laying around, they would not hesitate to scavenge that. On the other end of the spectrum, many of the dinosaurs, like Brontosaurus, like others related to that, these large, very slow-moving dinosaurs, they were going to be herbivores. In other words, plants were going to be their primary food source. We would often find these things living around lakes and wetlands and other places with water because that would provide some buoyancy for their large bodies, but at the same time too harbored a vast variety of plants for them to chew on. In terms of the bird story, we do have a lot of evidence from the fossil record to show that dinosaurs, at least in some stages of their lives, had feathers. That's one thing. So for instance, when we've seen some young dinosaur fossils, so in other words, you know, these are going to be the babies of dinosaurs. They hatch out of the eggs and they'll have this down on them, you know, just like birds in a nest, that when they hatch they have this very fluffy down. That helps with what we call thermoregulation, or their ability to maintain a certain internal temperature. So there is that evidence. There's also fossils that show dinosaurs that are well covered in feathers. And a lot of these have come out of China and other areas of Southeast Asia. But they were probably much more widespread than that. So then ultimately we see the transition forms like the famous Archaeopteryx. It is a dinosaur that is well covered with feathers and shows many of the same characters that our living birds have today. A second major line of evidence is the concept of hollow bones. Birds can fly because they have hollow bones. So next time you bite into a chicken leg, bust the bone open and you'll see that it's quite hollow and very lightweight. If you happen to have a chance to hold a songbird in your hand, it's almost as though nothing's there. It weighs so little. It's an adaptation for flight. Now think about it. You have these very large animals, much larger than, say, our African elephants and Indian elephants of today. There's evidence to show that their bones were also somewhat hollow, allowing them to support that large bulk and reduce the weight that they have to carry around with them.
First of all, again, it depends on your presuppositions. I mean, I don't believe that dinosaurs or birds evolved from dinosaurs. So when I look at the evidence, that's clearly not what I'm going to see. And clearly, if somebody believes that, they're going to see that in the evidence. Now, again, I think their evidence is pretty, but that being said, even presuppositions aside, the evidence is really non-existent. I mean, there was a recent article about, you know, they kept talking about feathers, you know, that's a big one, being associated with dinosaurs. And what they've actually found now is that they're really not feathers. I mean, they're other structures, because they've really, really looked at them closely now, which they hadn't done before. Again, because they wanted to see feathers, they saw feathers, but that doesn't make it true. And so now that they've looked at it more closely, they've determined, no, these are just other structures. They're not actually feathers. And we don't even know what a proto-feather would it look like, you know, something that could become a feather. We don't know what that would even look like. So there's really the evidence, you know, presuppositions aside, the evidence is very poor for the dino-bird link.
But what could have inspired all these stories? Is the dragon simply the creation of inventive minds? Or could dragon stories be based in reality, possibly related to dinosaurs or other amazing reptiles that we find in the fossil record? Many scientists contend that dinosaurs died off over 60 million years before humans came to be. The possibility that humans and dinosaurs ever coexisted is unthinkable to them. But what does the Bible say? Genesis 1 tells us that God made the animals of the land, air, and sea in the same week that He created human beings. In this case, humans would have been alive on the earth at the same time as these creatures. Dinosaur fossils, believed to be laid down during Noah's flood, suggests that dinosaurs were certainly alive at the time of Noah, only a few thousand years ago. And since the Bible tells us that Noah took pairs of every kind of land animal on board the ark, he certainly brought dinosaurs with him as well. This is consistent with recent discoveries of soft tissue and red blood vessels preserved in dinosaur fossils, a find that suggests dinosaur bones are not nearly as old as many scientists assume.
The Cleveland Museum of Natural History and the Creation Museum have contrasting views on other areas of science, such as the age of the Earth.
When you ask a question about age, you're actually asking a history question, not really a science question, although you can use science to confirm your answer, certainly. But when you're asking a history question, the best place to go is a history book. And we actually have a history book that tells us the origin of the universe, and it's the Bible. And a lot of people object to that, but the fact is the Bible claims to be not only just a history book, but the Word of God, and we better take it seriously if it really is the Word of God. So the Bible tells us that the world is a few thousand years old because it tells us God created in 6 days. It's clear from context. Those are ordinary, approximately 24-hour days because they're bounded by evening and morning and things like that. And it gives us the ages of certain of the patriarchs, the age between parents and descendants, and there's long lists of genealogies, and so begat so-and-so. You can add up those ages, and we find that the Earth's roughly somewhere around 6,000 years old. Wouldn't put an exact date on it.
The Earth at our latest reckoning is 4.5 billion years old, perhaps give or take a few million. We know this because of rocks not only found on the Earth, but also brought back from the moon. During the Apollo missions, for example, in the early 1970s, astronauts brought back a series and samples of various lunar rocks. They were tested and proved to be every bit as old as Earth-type rocks, terrestrial rocks.
Anytime you do an age calculation like that, you have to make some assumptions about the past, especially how light has traveled in the past. Does it really travel in space the way it does on Earth? I think a lot of those assumptions are pretty reasonable in this case. But there are some that may be off. For example, we know that time can flow at different rates in different environments. That's something Einstein predicted. And there's one prominent creationist cosmology that actually allows light to get from those most distant galaxies to Earth in a few thousand years using gravitational time dilation. And Russ Humphreys promotes that was really his model that he came up with. And it turns out that if the universe is finite, that is, if the galaxies stop at a certain point and there simply aren't any more beyond that, and I think that's actually likely the more I think about it. That makes sense to me from a creationist perspective. If that's the case, and if Earth is near the middle somewhere, if our solar system is kind of near the middle, then that generates a gravitational well. It doesn't mean we feel any more gravity, but it does mean it would require gravity, it would require energy to pull something away from the Earth out to the depths of space. And if that's the case, and I think it's likely, then that would mean time would flow more quickly at the edge of the universe than on Earth. And so the Earth would age only a few thousand years while light trickles in at its ordinary rate. And from our point of view, it only takes thousands of years then to get the light from the most distant galaxies to Earth. Now that might not be the right answer, but it's certainly an interesting possibility.
The light from stars, in attempting to explain how old our solar system is, we would rely, I think, on the relative age of the sun itself. The sun is a star, and we can examine it. We can examine how much its volume is, how much gas it's got. We have a good idea of its relative density, even though it does get more dense toward its core. And based on these physical parameters, we can figure out a rate at which the sun has been burning its hydrogen fuel. It burns by fusion. Inside the core of the sun is a fusion furnace. It's a tremendous amount of gas that bears down crushing pressure, forces hydrogen nuclei to fuse with one another. They in turn fuse with helium nuclei, and so on in a chain reaction, which generates energy. And that energy pushes outward. So you have gravity pulling inward to initiate the fusion furnace. The reaction results in radiation, which pushes outward. And based on this amount of rate of fuel burning, we can deduce fairly reliably that the sun has been around for about 5 billion years, burning its gaseous fuel, and likely to be around for an approximate another 5 billion years.
What about early hominids? Do humans evolve from these mammals?
Just because we have similarities doesn't mean that we evolved one from another. I mean, it's looking at the same thing as saying, okay, is it due to the same creator, or the same creator creating everything, or is it due to a common ancestor? We all share one common ancestor and all evolved from that. It just depends on how you look at it. And when we look at even the man, ape to man, sort of sequence, and you see, gradually getting bigger and bigger, more upright, and all those kinds of things, and a lot of people really accept that. But the fossil evidence for that is, first of all, extremely poor. But secondly, it depends on how you look at that. I look at that. I have no problem with there being fossil discoveries of those organisms. I mean, that's not a problem. Most of them were probably some sort of extinct ape that is no longer with us. Some of them, like Neanderthals, are clearly human, and so they're one or the other. They're not both. I don't see this continuum. I see you have the apes and you have humans, and they're completely separate.
If we go back in time, back approximately 5 or 7 million years ago, really not that long ago in terms of geological time, but in evolutionary time, that's a good long while, there was kind of an offshoot off of chimpanzees, which produced one of the first early human ancestors. In other words, a small bipedal primate. Now, they then did not crossbreed eventually with chimpanzees. They created their own lineage. They lived in their own habitat. They had their own habits. And this lineage eventually, over say 5 million years, led up to the evolution of Homo sapiens through a whole series of other transitions as well. And then the other primates like chimpanzees and orangutans, they continued to prosper and they produced other lineages which may have went extinct, others stayed valid. So it's because of this kind of common ancestry that we're talking about going back several million years. We can begin to see a lot of the same physical features, some behavioral features, and certainly very close genetic features as well.
Camels and llamas, so different and living on different continents, yet able to breed together and produce young. Examples abound of species that can be bred together. Zebras with horses, tigers with lions, potatoes with hot peppers, and so on. This amazes biologists. Based on modern rates of change, new species should quickly lose their ability to interbreed with other species. So, modern species that interbreed must have formed recently and rapidly. It's amazing that camels and llamas, though separated by oceans and thousands of miles, came from the same parents in relatively recent times. So how could such major changes have arisen so rapidly? This is a mystery to biologists because they don't see such widespread rapid change today. And they don't know of any natural process that can create the biological information necessary for such changes. The biblical account of creation may provide the answer to this mystery. The Bible reveals that God created all the animal and plant kinds in the beginning. And we're now learning that God placed a huge amount of information within each created kind, allowing them to diversify into the myriad of plants and animals we see today. The information was there, all there, right from the start. This is not evolution from a lower form of life. It's creation by an all-knowing, all-powerful, infinitely wise Creator who is worthy of our worship and praise.
There's been papers out in the last several years that have basically shown that even within a period of 2 or 3 years, you can get a huge amount of change in the population of finches. Now, is that evolution? No, that's simply change within the population. So, for example, if you have finches that have really large beaks and really small beaks, and because of competition and because of food sources, the small-beaked ones are favored, then what will happen? Well, they'll be able to get more nutrients, they'll be able to produce the ones that reproduce and give offspring, whereas the large-beaked ones will die off, and so you get proportionately more small-beaked finches, so to speak. Now, that could change. It's very what we call oscillating. You don't always have the same population. Now, let's say competition changes, food sources changes. A lot of times it's due to drought and rainfall there on the Galapagos Islands. So now you go the opposite way. Now the large ones are favored. And so you always have some of those in the population, but there may not be a lot of them. Now those are favored, and boom, you get a lot more of those. But that's definitely not evolution. That's an example of adaptation or natural selection in action. And in fact, it was a creationist by the name of Edward Blyth who actually was the one that came up with the idea of natural selection some 20 years before Darwin even published on it. He had published on it, and Darwin actually had knowledge of Blyth's work. And so, but again, he held to the idea that God created organisms, created kinds, and that, again, what we're seeing, natural selection is merely about, change within those, not from one to the other.
Skeptics question evolution, But many people feel there are several pieces of extenuating evidence to back evolution.
The genetic evidence for evolution and the DNA sequencing and being able to actually map exactly when a gene mutated and formed a certain structure in an organism to allow it to take off in another direction from an evolutionary point of view is astounding. And there are multiple ways that genes can be manipulated, can be changed over time, and to think that everything is static, that there's no change in the genetic makeup ever that has taken place on this planet is just total lunacy, because it occurs every time, every day, every hour of the day in organisms all over this planet.
There's a whole lot of evidence out there, and it's not just evidence, it is conclusions drawn, good empirical data. And this may relate from the fossil record, it may relate to what we see happening contemporarily right now, and we can also see the change in species populations over time genetically, so we're even getting down to the molecular level. And yes, I've heard the argument from people who are trying to teach, for instance, intelligent design creationism, and they turn around and say, you don't have enough evidence to show that, say, for instance, the eye evolved from, say, a simpler mechanism. Well, that's certainly not true, because there's a large body of evidence in the scientific literature that describes this process and describes the evidence for it. So it's been certainly something that's been shown conclusively within the laboratory. Not only that, but it's been shown conclusively within the legal system. You may remember a couple of years ago at the Dover trials in Pennsylvania, where creationism was going to be taught in the classroom, and that was found to be illegal because of the separation of church and state. One of the primary arguments was this concept that the eye could not have evolved from something else. It is too complex. And they gave it the term, there's this irreducible complexity. In other words, you make the eye simpler, the human eye simpler than what it is now, it would fail to exist. So therefore, evolution is false. Well, in the courtroom, the other side produced a pile of scientific papers. And the people making the argument for irreducible complexity said, no, that's still not enough. So the other side of the aisle produced another set of scientific papers and put it on the pile. And the people trying to teach intelligent design creationism in the scientific classroom said, no, that's not enough. And this persisted, and the pile got higher and higher till the judge finally sat down and said, this is ridiculous. There is plenty of information supporting the scientific principle. And in fact, in his write-up for the trial, basically thought that this argument of irreducible complexity, even in the face of a huge body of literature, was a ridiculous argument. So it's been defeated both in the laboratory and in the courtroom.
Despite the Creation Museum's rejection of evolution, evolution was occurring amongst their exhibits.
The thing is, there are Christians, obviously, that are Christians, that are born-again Christians, but believe in evolution. And I think they have a real paradox in their life, a real conflict, because if they truly believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ and that Jesus died on the cross for our sins and rose again, and do not question that, which is clearly miraculous and clearly not explainable by scientific evidence, then why would they question the first book of the Bible, which is also, I mean, God creating everything in 6 24-hour days out of nothing is clearly miraculous, clearly not explainable by science in that sense. We can study it afterwards, but to understand how that happened is clearly a miracle. And so I think they have a real paradox, because why should they believe this part of the Bible if they don't, the New Testament, or if they don't believe the Old Testament?
Despite the many differences between the two museums, there are several similarities. Both museums do not believe there is intelligent life on other planets.
I am very skeptical of life out in space, mainly for biblical reasons, but for scientific as well. The Bible tells us God formed the earth to be inhabited. In Isaiah 45:18, God made it to be inhabited. The universe to declare God's glory, but not really to be inhabited. Now, the Bible doesn't say there's not life in space, so it wouldn't disprove it if we found some, but I wouldn't expect that based on biblical creation. The earth is special, it's unique, whereas in the evolution model, the earth's just another planet.
The National Aeronautics and Space Administration has been trying for some time to determine, for example, if there is life on Mars. In 1976, Viking landers were equipped with a means to try and test the soil of Mars for life. The results were inconclusive. Some of the later landers that are going to Mars will do that as well, test for the possibility of life. Can life survive in other worlds? Yes, but not life as we know it, or at least not human life so far as we know. We have to take tanks of oxygen, lots of food, things that will allow us a comfortable habitat. The kinds of life on other worlds could be microbial. That's not out of the realm of possibility. but we don't have good firm evidence that life like us, a technological civilization, is out there.
In 2006, scientists decided to declassify Pluto as a planet. These two institutions unanimously agreed to that.
A planet has to have a certain mass, it has to be round, and it has to be able to, in effect, clear out its neighborhood. So if there's any debris left over from its formation, then it would then not be considered a planet. So when you consider all these things, yes, Pluto's round, it's got mass to a certain degree, but in effect it hasn't cleared its neighborhood of excess debris. That doesn't necessarily qualify it in astronomers' terms as a planet. It's been relegated to an emerging class of worlds called dwarf planets.
Personally, more or less agree with the decision that to declassify it as a planet, because we're finding a lot of other things at that distance that are about the same size as Pluto. Some of them are smaller. One of them is bigger, and that forced the issue, because do you classify Eris as the new planet, or do you classify it as one of these many other trans-Neptunian objects that are out there? And so they decided to go ahead and declassify Pluto as merely one of these many trans-Neptunian objects. It's not the first time that happened. When the asteroids were first discovered, Ceres and Vesta and Pallas, some of those first asteroids, they were classified as planets when they were first discovered, until we realized, oh, there are thousands of these things, and they're not very big. So they were then declassified. And so the same thing happened with Pluto. The difference is it took over 70 years with Pluto.
Satan was found lingering in the Garden of Eden. Surprisingly, in the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, Satan was found, but as the form of a gaboon viper. But enough with the conclusions by the museums. What conclusions do patrons make? All the patrons of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History had the same conclusions about dinosaurs and other topics. Even though many patrons of the Creation Museum did not originally share the same conclusions about dinosaurs and other topics, they did after their experience at the museum.
Based on the evidence, I would say yes, I do believe that man existed alongside dinosaurs.
I never thought about it in that way until recently when the Creation Museum opened up. And then I believe that's true, that dinosaurs did live alongside people.
Yeah, I believe that dinosaurs lived alongside people.
I think the Earth is probably, from what I'm getting in the Creation Museum here, 4,000 or 5,000 years old.
I believe it's 4,000 years or 6,000 years old. Around 4,000 years old, somewhere around there.
According to the evidence presented at the museum, and what I believe that it's probably around 5,000 years old.
Children often travel to museums on field trips for educational purposes. With the growing popularity of the Creation Museum, should creationism be taught in public schools?
We firmly believe here in our department that the creation story of life, the origins of life, does not belong as part of the biological science curriculum. Primarily the reason is because creationism is based on a faith mandate, whereas the evolutionary theory is based on scientific evidence over a long period of time, the last 150 years plus archaeological findings prior to that. And since science is supposed to be based on the scientific method, which is testing, hypothesizing, experimentation, and conclusions about knowledge past and present, we firmly believe here that evolution is the only theory that should be taught about the origins of life.
I do not support the teaching of creationism in public schools. And you would find that true of basically everybody here at Answers in Genesis. So that is not something we support, because I do not want somebody who does not understand this teaching this. I think that's a very bad idea, because most likely it's going to be highly distorted and very one-sided, and I don't want that happening. What I want in schools is people to teach the philosophy of science. That's what I want to see. I want to see. Let's talk about the difference between historical and operational science. Let's talk about what the limitations are on both of those. And let's really look at that. And if you do that, I mean, it's going to become obvious to most students, and most children even are going to see that, hey, wait a minute, something's not right here. I need to really look at this issue a little bit more and ask more questions about it. So we really want to see the philosophy of science taught, really a proper understanding of science. And then all these other things will come out of that possibly, but but not creationism in the public schools, not intelligent design in the public schools, because that's not really the right approach to it.
I certainly would like teachers who want to present challenges to Darwinian evolution or millions of years to have the opportunity to do so. I think that's only fair that students know that information. That's one of the things that, like I said, made me angry and made me want to go into this ministry, is I didn't get exposed to that information. And when you only present one side like that and you don't present evidence to the contrary, that's not good education.
We've actually designed the museum to attract families and young people in particular, because they're the ones who are typically going to a public school. They're watching a lot of television and they're getting an evolutionary worldview in many, many corners. And so those are the young people we're concerned about that may, when they become adults, decide to leave the church because they think perhaps evolution has shown that the Bible can't be trusted. So that's why we have the animatronic dinosaurs, the videos, the special effects theater, because we do want to attract young families here. It's the mother who makes the decision to come to the museum. That's why we actually have television spots, television commercials on Oprah, and those programs where women would be watching. We guess too, again, we've only been open for a few weeks, but we guess there are a lot of young people saying, Mom, Dad, I want to go to that creation museum to see the dinosaurs. So there could be some pressure, let's say, applied by children to their parents to come here.
Well, we're certainly not here to be teaching to the choir. I mean, how many times in history have we had incidents where new knowledge coming forth has disrupted the society? That is no reason not to teach the truth or to teach the scientific explanation for something that explains the way we came to be on the planet. If we cannot believe that hypotheses that are formulated by scientists and tested to give us plausible explanations for the way the world works are not real and are not genuine, then we will continue to miss the opportunities to take advantage of these findings and advance our society in a forward direction. The longer we stay mired in questions of conjecture and guessing, when really there is no guessing, it continues to lead us down a perilous path to less and less reliance on science and more reliance on other factors that are not going to help us as a society in the long run.
I haven't uttered my beliefs, but if someone has a belief, for example, in creationism, they're entitled to that belief. In this country, the United States, we're allowed to worship or not as we see fit. And if someone wants to hold certain beliefs, that's fine. That's fine for them. But when someone wants to use a series of beliefs, for example, as a template for scientific inquiry, that makes for some problems. It makes for problems trying to validate that information. And when you can't validate the information for widespread acceptance and dissemination, it makes it difficult for science to advance. People can pursue things as they're wanted to do, but science looks for validation.
We live in a diverse world that's always been huge in terms of different forms of culture, different ways of looking at the world and so forth. And I don't have a problem if somebody looks at the world differently than I do. As a scientist, and frankly as a person who lives in the great community of Earth, I would want the technology, the medical techniques, and everything else that I use to be based upon science. Right? I don't want to say if I have to go in for surgery someday, I don't want to have to rely upon prayer to ensure that the surgery goes well. I want the surgeon to be basing his or her decisions on how to cut me open and fix me and sew me back up based upon good scientific information. If I pray, I would be praying to comfort myself.
I firmly believe that the issue along the creationist and the evolutionary debate is the fact of if we cannot believe the Bible in its literal interpretation, then, and the Bible gives us the reason for why we are existing on the planet, and if that isn't true, in the Judeo-Christian ethic, it would be we're here to become better individuals so that when we die, we will eventually attain the reward of heaven. And if the biblical interpretation of how we get to heaven is not the right one, then why can't any other explanation be true as well? And I think that really throws a scare into a lot of people and puts people into kind of a quagmire of, well, then what should I believe and why am I here and what's my purpose and all of that? Well, you know, maybe you need to figure that out for yourself. I really believe that people fear that if they do not believe the Genesis story, that somehow that diminishes their standing as a human being on the planet. And there's no reason to live, or why are we here, or I really want to get back to that. I think that, to me, that's the foundation of why there is such a controversy. People need a reason to be alive. And I don't see how evolution is even a threat, because certainly there are evolutionists, maybe not pure evolutionists, but there are people, millions of people, who believe that evolutionary theory could have been the plan by which the Creator decided that life would come to be on this planet. So, I mean, those explanations there's nothing to really fear, in my own personal opinion.
Two museums, two different approaches to science. Despite the controversy, children as well as adults will ultimately have to decide on their own whether to believe a scientific viewpoint or a creationist one, or both. For the foreseeable future, however, these two viewpoints will continue to struggle to coexist.